Welcome back to the Tech and Real Estate Podcast. Today, I'm thrilled to have Simon, the mind behind the Uneducated Economist YouTube channel. Known for his insightful breakdowns of the economy, Simon offers a unique perspective, especially for real estate investors. From his deep dives into lumber markets to his views on Federal Reserve policy, Simon helps make complex economic concepts accessible. We'll discuss recession trends, the impact of corporate policies on real estate, and what real estate investors should consider in today's evolving market. Let's get started. Hey, Simon, welcome to the show.
Well, good morning. Glad to be here. Thank you for the invite.
Very excited today. You're actually the first person that I have on the podcast that has a deep understanding of the economy, how it runs, how it relates to what's going on in real estate. So looking forward to everything we're going to touch on. But first, would love to hear more about your background.
My name is Simon. I'm host of the YouTube channel Uneducated Economist. I started the channel in November of 2017. I just kind of had this hobby of studying economics and was able to explain it to my friends and family. So a lot of them was really encouraging in trying to get me to find a platform. And it really took off one day when I had a coworker who just really came up one day and says, listen, you need to start a blog or a YouTube channel or something because nobody here understands anything you're talking about and you're driving us crazy. So from that day, I said, okay, I went down, fired up the camera, created a YouTube channel, and started the Uneducated Economist, and been doing research and videos ever since.
Excellent. So it wasn't even that you wanted to gain fame or anything like that. You're just, this is my topic. I love discussing this and, let me have a platform to reach out to more folks.
Yeah, essentially that's what it was. I've been working lumber industry pretty much my entire life. So I also am from the Pacific Northwest. So I had a pretty good insight into the lumber industry and had been putting out lumber videos for quite a few years before lumber took off and had its all-time high, and of course got a lot of attention, and my YouTube channel got a lot of attention from that. And so it really took off during that time, during the COVID period, when people were looking to see what was going on. My channel just got a lot of attention.
Yeah, and I love how you break concepts down really simply as well. So one of the topics that you've been discussing a lot is a recessionless recession. If you don't mind explaining what that is and how it relates to maybe real estate investors.
To talk about the recessionless recession, during COVID, essentially there was a period of time in which we had an incredibly tight jobs market. And also during that time, there was essentially a bailout of the corporations that not a lot of people knew was taking place. And it was something called the corporate debt lending facility. During the COVID pandemic, the Federal Reserve had set up 13 lending facilities to backstop pretty much every corner of the financial market. One of them was called the corporate debt lending facility. It was funded with hundreds of billions of dollars and had been put out there for a promise to buy corporate debt. They were going to buy like the fallen angels to make sure that they had plenty of liquidity to keep running. And of course, like me and a lot of other people out there started, losing our minds over this, thinking that the Federal Reserve was going to be picking the winners and losers. Well, it turned out during that time, they did buy a little bit of corporate debt, but for the most part, they didn't buy any, right? It was very minimal amount. The idea of them buying it had the markets trying to front run the Federal Reserve. So they went out there and started buying into a lot of corporate debt, which then gave these corporations to gorge on a lot of really cheap interest rates. And so they loaded up on money. During that time, they had to do something with it. And so they started buying buildings, equipment, expansion, hiring people. And that hiring people is really what caused this super tight jobs market. So now we move into the future as we come into, pandemic's over. Now we're starting moving into what would be a recession. Well, what is the two worst parts of a recession? Right? Corporations get bailed out and people lose their jobs. But if we roll into this recession with corporations already being bailed out, like the ones that are failing are the zombie corporations who never should have existed in the first place, and the ones who are sitting on cash are able to pay their bills, then really there is no need to bail out the corporations. And if you have this tight jobs market, people who lose their good high paying job will have to take another job in the service industry or something of a lesser pay. It may not be a good job, but it's a job, and you don't show up on the unemployment scale. So now here we have this situation that is taking place where the corporations are failing, but they're not necessarily getting bailed out. The good corporations are sitting on cash, and the unemployment still sits at a historically low level, right? The recessionless recession.
I never considered that how like someone who may lose, say, a white collar job, they go into, say, service industry, how they're not going to show up on that report of unemployment, but they have essentially like switched domains and kind of taken jobs from maybe folks who usually are in that domain as well.
Well, it could. But I mean, I think at this point that would show up as unemployment as well, and still you would see the rise of it. So it'd just be kind of like a flipping of it. Ultimately, I think that's really what ended up happening. I know people who are in the service industry, they talk about the short staff and how it's hard to find anybody, and they're all demanding high wages and stuff like that. So that would make a lot of sense that if you were losing your high paying job and you do move to the service industry, you're going to be demanding the highest wage you could possibly get because you got to make up for it. So, how long this plays out, who knows? If we still continue down this path, you will find eventually unemployment will rise. And if unemployment rises significantly, then the Federal Reserve will have no other choice but to start to act upon that because of their dual mandate of low and stable prices and whatever that means. And, because I laugh at that, low and stable prices, like, or low inflation with stable prices is what it is. And then full employment. And so if unemployment begins to rise, the Federal Reserve has to do something about that because of their dual mandate. They're not required to do anything about elections. They're not required to do anything about, a lot of stuff that people might think that the Federal Reserve is mandated to do. They're not. It's two things: low inflation with stable prices and full employment. That's it.
Interesting. And I actually have a question for you. So I was
So
doing a little bit of research in like what could be happening for these large corporations that are asking for return to office mandates. So I'm originally from New Jersey, so commuting to New York, and a lot of folks that I used to work with, they moved in the pandemic towards like the outskirts, so maybe 2 hours away from the office because they thought either I'm staying remote or I will only have to go in once every 2 weeks, for example. But now with return to office, possibly like 5 days a week, these commutes are really, really long. So I do have someone in my network who they found a deal recently because someone had a low interest rate they bought in 2020 and they have to go back to the office. They're looking for other jobs because they don't want to have to do that commute, but it's really hard to find other tech jobs right now. They thought it was going to kind of be similar, like where you could just switch easily back in 2020, 2022. So they sold their house subject to this person in my network, which worked out on both ends. They were able to then move back closer to the office, and then the person that I know acquired the deal at a lower rate. So from your perspective, if hiring is slowing down and folks aren't able to move freely between jobs, mandates are occurring, do you think that could be an impact on real estate of people kind of rebounding, moving back closer to offices?
I would say yes. If that was to be prevalent within the economy for any length of time, like, I mean, if that was like a very hardcore demand that they return back to the office and leave those areas that had, maybe not been accessible to them before, then I would assume that yes, that would have an impact. I am experiencing that in my area where we do have a lot of remote workers who had left the Portland area to come out to, the safer coastal towns. And along with a growing retirement village and a growing hospital district, we are finding the impacts of higher wages that then go into the rental incomes, go into the housing prices, and the normal jobs, the service industry jobs, the retail jobs just simply are having a very difficult time finding where it is that they can be to live. Now, if those remote workers were to suddenly have to go back to the Portland area, it's too far of a commute from Astoria to Portland. And so if that was to take place on any kind of significant scale, then I would assume that that would open up some rental properties for the people here. But again, like, I would imagine that would have to be pretty significant in order to draw that many people away. for it to actually have any kind of real impact. So that's just me in my local area from my observation. So depending on how much those remote workers moved into a particular area and how demanding it is that they go back to the office, I think it's very relative to what kind of impact that would have on that particular area.
Yeah, very dependent on the city, their infrastructure, and then also like when the pain point actually occurs for the individual. For someone, maybe driving 2 hours isn't too bad of a commute.
It might be not too bad, like, particular months out of the year. And then you find like, other months it turns into like 3 hour commutes.
Exactly. So, what's going on in your world as you're looking at the economy today, as of mid to late October?
I mean, I guess it depends on what part of it you're looking at and what it is that, we have going on. Like I follow monetary policy from the Federal Reserve. That's my key thing that I just kind of focus in on. Now I'm in the lumber industry, so I kind of use lumber to be my guide to where I feel things are going. And what's interesting about lumber is that about a year ago is that it completely crashed. Like it dropped all the way back down to its pre-COVID levels. There is no demand for lumber. Prices are in down, not moving very much. And so this is a very surprising position for lumber to be in, considering just a few years ago everybody was pointing at it saying, look at, money printer go burr, prices go up. No better example than lumber. So when I follow the economy, I look at things that are so far different from most people out there that it ends up sounding like this very like weird esoteric thinking that I have on it. But it's really my understanding of monetary policy comes directly from the speeches and communications of the Federal Reserve itself. So prior to the COVID pandemic, lockdowns, money printer, stimulus packages, the Federal Reserve was sitting in a position in which that they were not able to find the inflationary scenario that they were looking for. And this is after quantitative easing one, two, three, and four that took a balance sheet from $850 billion to over $4.5 trillion. And yet the inflationary scenario that they were looking for was non-existent. Even Donald Trump at the end of his administration was saying there was no inflation. The Fed should be printing money, taking interest rates into negative territory. It was crazy thinking. But anyway, I mean, I have another theory about that altogether. But ultimately, there was no inflation, and the Federal Reserve was sitting in a position in which that they needed it. In fact, there was a speech that came out from Fed President John Williams where he said that the problem that they needed to solve these days was the risk of inflation that was persistently too low rather than too high. And this is, again, like some of the most backwards thinking that most people would be believing right now coming from the Federal Reserve, but they were looking for inflation. And now the other problem that came from that was something called the neutral interest rate. So I know I'm going to kind of just really hit on us a lot of stuff here, and I'm going to try and keep it short. But it's really important to understand all this to know where we are today. So another part of this is something called the neutral interest rate. And this is the rate that is neither accommodating nor restricting the economy. It's when the Federal Reserve is neutral. And now this neutral interest rate over the last 25 years had fallen close to zero. In fact, a lot of people were saying that it was at zero or maybe slightly above it. There was some estimates of it at a 1.5%. There is no real way of knowing exactly where the neutral interest rate is at any current moment. You can look at it in the past, but in the present, only can be estimated. So the Federal Reserve uses something that they refer to as R star, right? So this R star estimate of where the Federal Reserve believes that the neutral interest rate is was so low that when they go to stimulate the economy, they hit zero with the Fed funds rate, zero interest rate policy, and they're not far enough below neutral in order to stimulate because they need to be significantly below this neutral interest rate. During quantitative easing one, two, three, and four, Ben Bernanke era, they had estimated that that the Fed funds rate would have to go negative 6% to be far enough below neutral to stimulate the economy. So they knew that it wasn't going to work. They hit zero interest rate policy and then fired up quantitative easing. And quantitative easing was the way that they were able to inject money into the system as opposed to lowering of interest rates, which would typically have you and me going out and buying houses and cars and going on vacation. So that's how the Federal Reserve was able to continue to use their monetary policy to stimulate the economy, even though they had hit the lower bound of zero and the low neutral interest rate. The problem with it is that all that money didn't produce the inflationary scenario that they were looking for. So as the Fed was trying to get their ammo back, which is the rising of the interest rates, the Fed funds rate, this is during the Trump administration, they were only able to get it to 2.5%. That 2.5% is not significantly high enough above neutral to actually to be able to, what am I trying to say here? That 2.5% is not high enough in order to drop the neutral interest rate or to be able to drop below the neutral interest rate enough to stimulate the economy. Does that make sense? Because you're going to hit the lower bound again. So what they needed was an inflationary scenario. With the inflationary scenario, they could raise that Fed funds rate up significantly. The people's perception of what was going on in the economy was going to demand higher interest rates for the return on their capital investment because of the inflationary scenario. If you are going to expect higher prices, then you're going to expect a higher return on your capital investment. So interest rates start being pulled up in every direction, including the neutral interest rate. So during this inflationary time, the neutral interest rate had begun to rise. So if you go and look at estimates of R-star was moving up during the pandemic era inflationary scenario that everybody thought was going to turn into a hyperinflation scenario. So now here we are sitting today, right, in a position in which that the Fed is now somewhat significantly above the neutral interest rate, but the neutral interest rate is beginning to drop. You can see this in the estimates of R-star. So when the Federal Reserve cuts rates, they're really just following the neutral interest rate, which doesn't actually move anything within the economy. It doesn't restrict or stimulate any more than what they were before if they are just keeping in lockstep with the neutral rate. The only major problem that comes from this is that if we do run into any kind of significant downturn, the dropping of the Fed funds rate will hit the lower bound of zero again and still not be far enough below neutral to stimulate the economy. And they're going to have to figure out a way to go into stimulus spending again. The only problem with this being is that they know that if they go into major stimulus spending, that's the government going into debt, that they are going to put them on an unsustainable debt path, which will then crash the government's financial books and balance sheet and all that. Did I get all that? I
That
mean,
was excellent. Yes. I do have a question. So
yeah.
if they're going in lockstep right now,
Mm-hmm.
and there ideally needs to be a spread, a larger spread in case there's something that occurs and we need to have quantitative easing. So how does a Fed make that spread?
Like
What's
what?
the ideal situation? So right now they're in lockstep with the neutral interest rate. What's the ideal situation for them to be in today?
I guess what they would like if you were to ask them what position would you like to be in,
Yeah.
they would like to be at neutral with the Fed funds rate, where they're
Okay.
neither accommodating nor restricting the economy. At that moment, they would love for employment to be like what they refer to as full employment, right? So an economy operating at its potential, right, with low prices and stable inflation, right, and in that full employment at neutral. That would be like their perfect moment. That's like, the Goldilocks moment, whatever you want to call it. Like that would be like absolutely awesome for them. And if they could maintain that neutral rate and maintain that position, 2% inflation, 2% inflation expectation on the long run, and, maintaining full employment, like that would be their awesomeness right there. But unfortunately, that's never existed in the history of time. Like never has that moment ever occurred. Like there's been moments where they briefly touch it, but it's always going to move past it or beyond it because no matter what, you're always going to have people who are constantly changing. People are going to want to earn more money. They're going to want to earn better. They're going to make mistakes. There's always kinds of stuff that's going to happen, which is going to cause them to have to fluctuate within this area where they, of just perfectness, right? But you can't maintain perfect ever. So it's always going to be somewhere around that they're attempting to go for. Since they had failed to produce the inflationary scenario over the last previous 10 years, What they're doing is going into what they refer to as makeup strategy. And you can actually look this up. It's called the Federal Reserve Makeup Strategy. And they have this long paper about it. Anyway, it's going to allow inflation to run extra hot, extra long for an extended period of time to make up for the fact that they failed to produce the inflationary scenario. Now, this ends up really interfering with the 2% target. Man, like idea that the Federal Reserve is going for a 2% target. But if they're going for a 2% target, how do they have an inflationary scenario that runs extra hot, extra long for an extended period of time to make up for the fact that they failed to achieve it? But that's when things had changed and nobody knew it. And so if you go and you look at monetary policy strategies for the long run, or the long run statement on monetary policy strategies, they'll even say it right in there. And it was reiterated by Jerome Powell in a speech August 27th of 2020. Yeah, 2020, August 27th. He says it in there that the Federal Reserve is no longer going for a 2% target and that they're actually going for a 2% average inflation rate over time, which means that appropriate monetary policy seeks to achieve inflation that is moderately above 2% for some time. And there is no mathematical formula for figuring out this inflationary process. Like literally says it straight up, black and white in a speech, right? That there is no mathematical formula for figuring this out. And so what it's going to be referred to as flexible average inflation targeting. And you can look this up, right? Again, it's not a 2% target. It's flexible average inflation targeting over time, looking for the long run. And if you listen carefully, when they are speaking, they usually add something to their statement of when we achieve our 2% goal, right? When we achieve 2% in the long run, when we achieve 2%, according to our strategy or whatever, they say something in there that doesn't necessarily mean that they are going for the target, even though you hear them say the 2% target. The 2% target is an average inflation rate over time with no mathematical formula to figure this thing out. And that's what's really cool about this whole strategy, is that it becomes really arbitrary to the Federal Reserve on when it is that they have achieved their goal. So you study a little bit more into it and you can find, okay, there is a way to figure out what this 2% average inflation rate over time is, because if you look back far enough in time, you will find it. So if we say, okay, last month, did we have a 2% average inflation, or let's say last year, from over the last year, do we have a 2% average inflation? No, it was much higher than that. You go back all the way through COVID, all this average inflation was much higher than 2%, but you start incorporating back during the great financial crisis and you take it all the way back to 2008, there is a moment there from the deviation from the 2% target that failed to achieve, that if you incorporate all that inflation, including the inflation that we have experienced way back in 2008 sometime, there was a period in which that we averaged 2% over time. So now we say, okay, there's a spot way back in time that we averaged 2%. So as we incorporate more inflation into our current average of where we are today, right? So if we experience more inflation, that date will begin to move either further away from us or closer to us, and we'll know how far away 2% really was as far as over the long run. That's backwards looking inflation, right? This is, again, I talk about this in my videos, and I have the documents that show, from the Federal Reserve how this is explained. It's hard to kind of imagine what this is or how this works, but once you see it, it becomes a lot clearer. If they ever achieve a moment in which that they do have 2% target, 2% average inflation, 2% expectation on the long run, that Goldilocks moment, again, with neutral interest rate and the Fed funds rate all lined up, they got full employment and they got low and stable prices going on, they can flip this look into forward-looking average inflation, where so now they can then adjust their monetary policy to make up for the fact that they missed it, or if the average inflation rate over time, the expectation begins to fall, again, they can begin to raise the inflation, the current inflationary scenario to make up for it. So it's no longer a target. It's either backward looking or forward looking. And this is something that almost nobody knows about. Like, nobody talks about this in any articles. You never hear them talk about it on TV. You never hear anything about this, but yet this is all well documented within the Federal Reserve, within their communications, essentially to each other.
Yeah, so absolutely fascinating, the information that you have and how it's all documented, like you said. One of the questions that I have when they're looking at like backwards looking and they're looking at a moving average to be around 2%, is there like ever a particular window? Like, is that 30 days, 90 days, 1 year, or is that like just flexible?
It's all flexible. And in fact, that's exactly what they call it, flexible average inflation targeting. If you type that into Google, type like Federal Reserve flexible average inflation targeting, you can find all the stuff that they talk about. Many of the Federal Reserve officials and, the banks have, paperwork that talks all about it. But you can't find news articles. You can't find economists talking about it. You can't find any Federal Reserve actually explaining it in an interview. Like you will not find any of that stuff. What is interesting but you'll find you'll find their documents within their own websites. Now, if you go and type in 2% target, inflation target, you will find all kinds of theories about it. You'll find all kinds of people talking about it. You'll find all this stuff. Now, there's a reason for this, right? There's a reason that they do this is because this is part of their strategy on how they conduct themselves with monetary policy, right? Because one of the biggest important elements that comes down to this is something called the credible threat theory. Now, this is something that I've developed over, I don't know, probably the last 5 years or so, after having read some speeches coming from Ben Bernanke back in 2002, talking about the moment that they hit the lower bound of zero. Like they knew it. They knew that there was going to be a problem with monetary policy once they have dropped, because they were seeing it coming. From the early 80s, the Fed funds rate was elevated up into the teens. They would use the Fed funds rate dropping at 5% to stimulate the economy. So if they were going into a downturn, drop at 5%, people go out there, borrow money, buy houses, cars, go on vacation, stimulate the economy, get money moving again. So this is the way the Fed operated all the way till they got to essentially what was zero. But they knew it was coming. Like Ben Bernanke knew it back in 2002, and he had a speech called Deflation and how to prevent it from ever occurring. Because that's the problem that they face, is that if they cannot stimulate the economy, they start rolling into deflationary scenario, which can actually spiral out of control. So they're not concerned about inflation as much as they are absolutely scared of deflation and a deflationary scenario. That is something that they could just like avoid at all costs. Now, what was interesting about this speech is that he goes into talking about how to prevent it from ever occurring. However, if all the measures fail, if all these measures to prevent deflation fail, and you end up at the zero lower bound, and you have no way of stimulating the economy, there is yet other ways of stimulating the economy beyond that of the monetary adjustments through interest rates. And now he said this. He goes, let me tell you a little story about a guy who invents a gold machine. See, if a guy invents this gold machine, he can produce gold at will with very little cost or energy. The moment that this information gets out to the markets, the price of gold would plummet, right? Even before the guy produces a single ounce of gold, even before the machine is even built, just the credible threat that he can do it. If it was scientifically verified and definitely he can make this happen, the price of gold would plummet on the market, right? Just the credible threat of it alone. So now this credible threat is now used within the economy today. It comes out of their speech. It comes out of their words. You can see it plain as day. In fact, that special purpose vehicle was a perfect example of a credible threat when it came to the economy, when it came to purchasing that corporate debt. Like the Federal Reserve put out all kinds of statements and news articles and interviews, and all kinds of people like myself was out there screaming, hey, they're going to be picking the winners and losers. There was all kinds of attention brought to it. And yet before the Federal Reserve even got the facility set up, the corporations had pretty much funded themselves, right? They got all the funding they really needed. They didn't even, at that point, they didn't even need to set up the special purpose vehicle because all the corporations were pretty much done. They got there. They got what they needed. That is just a small example of how they use this credible threat theory throughout the rest of their monetary policy when they operate at the lower bound of zero. They even said during normal times that they can continue to use forward guidance, signaling, jawboning. All their words can have a major impact on the economy. In fact, you could see that taking place over the last year. When we saw at the end of 2023, the Federal Reserve put out something called the dot plot. That dot plot predicted 7 interest rate cuts or something coming to 2024. People lost their minds. They thought for sure that there was going to be all this easing coming to the Federal Reserve fund rates, and they started acting accordingly. What did we see happen with mortgage rates? Mortgage rates went from 8% down to 6% during 2024. They had fallen. The Fed didn't do anything. The Fed sat on their hands the entire time. They did do a little bit of balance sheet adjustment, which did impact I would imagine, did impact the mortgage rate some. But for the most part, they really just sat on their hands with Fed funds rates, didn't move at all. And yet we saw mortgage rates drop dramatically. Then the promise that they were going to be out here lowering rates with this jumbo rate cut, and everybody prior to, the actual monetary policy adjustment was guaranteed that they were going to have better mortgage rates coming. They were all assuming it. Everybody expected it. The moment that the Federal Reserve cuts rates, you see mortgage rates go up, right? It went exactly opposite of what everybody was thinking. And so now when you take in the credible threat theory and you think about it for just a minute, you say, okay, so monetary policy adjustments through Fed funds rates and interest rates and all that is no longer the effective tool. What is the effective tool is the words that come out of the Federal Reserve. So now they put this idea, this forward guidance, this belief out into the market, very much like the idea of a gold machine coming to the market, and people start to act accordingly to that information that is being presented. So now there is no way that they could control the forward guidance out there of the people if they were to tell them and explain to them that they're going for a flexible average inflation targeting. Instead, they use the 2% target. They say, hey, look at that. This is how we do it. If we achieve our goal, we haven't achieved it yet. We always got this open-ended expectation out there of where it is that we're going with this, and yet there is no mathematical formula for figuring any of it out. Right? So again, I sit back and I think, okay, so the interest rate adjustments really don't mean that much. It means so much less than what people believe about that interest rate cut, how it is that the expectation of that interest rate cut, what it is that they are going to do in the future with this interest rate cut, because that is more important than the actual rate cut itself, the way that people behave in accordance to it.
I'm shocked. Yeah, I never thought about that, how the expectations and belief can actually influence so much more than the actual action itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they found that it was. See, and that's what's crazy about the Fed is that if you understand the Federal Reserve long enough, there was a time in which that they did not communicate. Like they would not tell you that they were going to do an interest rate adjustment. In fact, you would just wake up one morning and it was just like, whoa, the Fed had moved. Look at that, right? And everybody got shocked by it and they're like, oh crap, we got to do something about this now. And that's the way the Federal Reserve operated, is that they thought it was more powerful to shock the markets with an interest rate cut and not explain it, not even tell them that they did it. But then as time went on, they realized it was just like, well, if we communicate just a little bit about this thing, we can actually get a little bit more power out. We can actually get the markets to act in reaction, and that reaction has more power to the actual rate cut adjustments or raising or whatever it is that they're doing at the time. So as they were getting closer to the lower bound and they were realizing that this communication had so much power, they were like, hey, we need to set up more communication channels in order to get information out there. So they started presenting like the Fed meeting minutes. They started making announcements about rate cuts or possible policy adjustments. They started putting out this information that was then delivering the data that people could then use to make decisions prior to what it is that the Federal Reserve was doing. And they just kept expanding and expanding this. And now you got the Federal Reserve communicating in all kinds of ways out there. I mean, this was nothing that you heard before. I mean, the only person you would ever hear speaking coming from the Federal Reserve would be this old man, Greenspan, who would talk in a way that nobody understood anyway. And he actually prided himself with mumbling with great incoherency. And with great incoherence. And so it was like, it was funny to hear, how this changed, and how it is that they communicate in a way that now presents the information in a way that has the market reaction that they are looking for. Where before they used to shock the markets with the rate adjustments. Now the rate adjustments don't mean as much. Yeah,
Fascinating. Wow.
isn't it?
So much knowledge you have, Simon.
Thank
And with that, I think folks, especially real estate investors, could really gain an edge by listening to some of the content that you put out there, just to understand, get a pulse of what's going on. So, for those that want to follow you, how would they do so?
I'm pretty much active on YouTube. I mean, I have all the other, social media platforms and stuff like that, but pretty much I'm active on YouTube. It's where I put the most content out. It's where I do the most commenting. If you wanted to reach out through email, uneducatedeconomist@gmail, uh, I try to be as quick to respond on that, but I get flooded with emails now, so it's hard to kind of get through everything. So if you did send me an email and I didn't respond to it, just try it again, and I'll try to respond to it as quickly as I can. But yeah, that's ultimately where I'm at. Is usually just hanging out on YouTube, and you can find me there at the Gmail email account.
Excellent. We'll be sure to continue following you. And thank you so much for your time, Simon.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for having me on your show today.